Ideal versus description. In this presentation, I am going to argue that 1. Neoclassical economics is generally idealistic in an axiomatic sense. Neoclassical economics presents a veneer of descriptivism in its claim to be objective and free of value judgment. 3. Neoclassical economics is actually laden with value judgment and advocates for vast societal change, as well as using value judgments in its description of real-world economies. However, the exact idealistic and descriptive methodologies used and endorsed differed between different neoclassical economists, who frequently argued with each other about the subject. Here I will look specifically at the different methodologies envisioned by Walras and Pareto. What is idealism? Idealism is a subjectivist philosophical view which criticizes the mechanist view of science and instead builds a worldview based on subjectivity and phenomenology. This has ancient roots, as well as being incorporated by theorists such as Berkeley and later the German idealists such as Kant. Historically, there have been a number of different ways idealism has been interpreted. 1 is that ideas have a metaphysical importance themselves, which has little relevance to modern economics. 2 is that abstract ideas and reasoning can be central to a science, given relatively few axiomatic observations of the real world, inspired by the methodology of mathematics, and to a lesser extent by the methodology of physics. 3. Idealism can be an aspirational rather than analytical tool. Here the emphasis is placed on the ability to form often ambitious and imaginative goals and being able to formally reason about these utopian economies. What is descriptivism? Descriptivism focuses on the importance of analyzing observed rather than imagined or constructed phenomena. It places the role of science in its ability to correctly predict future events. Further, it often places importance on removing value judgments from analysis, describing rather than prescribing the actions of an economy. Again, this has multiple different meanings. 1. Studies should place focus on analyzing real-world things, rather than just comparing some degenerate real-world thing to other ideal things. This is, for example, the way in which it would be used in English, where a prescriptivist would discuss how other lower-class or less white dialects of English fail to measure up to BBC English, a dialect spoken by a minute fraction of English-speaking population in specific formal contexts. A descriptivist would focus on how other dialects work on their own terms, deriving more relevant grammatical rules and word definitions from real-world use of the dialect being studied. I do not think that neoclassical economics is descriptive in this sense, as it compares almost all real-world economies to idealized developed countries. 2. Models should be derived more through a sort of data mining process than through reasoning and Models should be derived more through a sort of data mining process than through reasoning and the search for intuitive, theoretical, and parsimonious explanations. I would argue that this is a wild overestimation of the power of theoretical statistical investigation and mischaracterizes sciences like physics. This was the view of descriptivism suggested by Pareto. 3. Science should not include any moral or subjective judgment. Idealism and descriptivism in economics. Marginal revolutionaries were very concerned about examining what descriptive and idealistic foundations could be used, given both the practical limitations of mathematics and statistics at the time and the desire to make economics feel more sciencey. This includes methodology as well as ideological debates. Some of these concepts, like the desirability of removing value judgments or the power of abstract reasoning in economics, even emerge in debates between heterodox and orthodox economics. Walras's idealism. Walras's claim of idealism is roughly the origin of what I call axiomatic idealism. However, unlike modern neoclassical economics, it was envisioned without econometrics. Thus, for Walras, axioms of human consumption and behavior should be observed, though not through behavioralist psychological methods, and these should then be used for deduction and policy prescription without much empirical testing of the deduced results. Further, Walras used idealism in a more utopian sense as well, describing general equilibrium as a possible and desirable state that one could reason about without directly observing. Walras's idea that one could prescribe policy of theoretical results with a little descriptive analysis does not match up with other sciences. Most engineering projects, which rely on sciences with much higher predictive capability than economics for their deductions, rely on large amounts of monitoring, management, and supervision when put into practice, and frequently find unexpected difficulties. Although Walras, and perhaps to a lesser extent Adam Smith, may have advocated for free markets on idealistic grounds, where the implementation was in some sense successful, was with slow rollout processes with time to evaluate and refine how these markets might work, and what policies and institutional frameworks were needed to maintain them. America and Britain moved slowly and cautiously from mercantilism and protectionism, whereas the collapse of the USSR shows the devastation that rapid and untested transition may have. This, as critical as I may be of liberal and neoliberal policies, where they have been successful, they have been implemented slowly and based on observed successes, not on abstract theory. It is true that liberalizing a particular market in a particular economy may be an unknown prediction, but we can rely on past experience of the liberalization of other markets in that country or the liberalization of the same industry in other countries. Sure, Adam Smith didn't know how a liberalized global economy would turn out, but he had observed smaller instances of more restricted and freer markets. This does not mean that policy suggestions should not seek change, or even necessarily that incrementalism is always the best course of action. But it does mean that policy recommendations should, whenever possible, be as grounded in analysis of existing systems as possible. To some extent, the perfection of the imagined system of perfect competition is used to dismiss the less perfect ideals of other theories, even when perfect competition seems wildly unlikely, such as in the case of natural monopolies. Pareto's claims of descriptivism. Pareto disliked Walras's idealism and instead attempted to ground economics in a descriptivist epistemology, where the only requirements of theory were to correctly predict future data. Thus he claimed that if a model including perfect competition and perfect foresight yields correct predictions, one cannot for this reason conclude that there is anything in the real world to which the words perfect competition and perfect foresight may be attached, only that events occur as if this were the case. This is true, but conceals a massive assumption. That is, that it is vanishingly unlikely that a theory based on mechanisms with no real-world parallels will correctly predict reality. And how on earth would one begin to try and construct a predictive model without analogous concepts to reality? It is true, for example, that mathematical breakthroughs in one field can help solve problems in other unrelated branches, which may be difficult to intuitively interlink, but this does not mean that the connection between the two branches is non-existent. In fact, category theory is devoted to showing precisely when and how concepts from different fields are related. Mathematicians aren't relying on faith that matrix algebra is homologous to linear transformations of objects in space. They have gone to a lot of effort to justify it, and concerns about mathematical concepts having had no real-world parallel, such as in the case of imaginary numbers, has demanded deep amounts of scrutiny until analogies such as circular motion and cyclical processes were found. The notion that such homeomorphisms exist outside mathematics and physics, let alone the notion that neoclassical economics is a homeomorphism for real-world economic processes, which relies on alternative mechanisms to arrive at a similar result, is a remarkable claim requiring a remarkable evidence. Perhaps a more reasonable interpretation is that of an approximation, but an approximation is grounded to the analogies with real forces. One cannot add arbitrary, non-observed forces to an approximation and expect it to work. It is true that if a dice roll consistently predicted GDP growth, it wouldn't mean that the economy ran on an analogous process to the mechanics of rolling dice. But this would never happen, and what Pareto is arguing for is devoting a science to trying to make and weight the perfect dice for the job, not abandoning this in favor of a mechanism which more directly imitates the economic process. While Pareto claimed to base his views on descriptivism, his own and many following ideas of general equilibrium remain grounded in Walras's idealism. One cannot simply denounce the idealism of general equilibrium theory and neoclassical theory more broadly while fully adopting its methodology, as this methodology cannot be fully justified on more descriptivist grounds. Pareto's ordinal rather than critical utility system shows both a minor movement towards descriptivism, moving from an unobservable utility to a theoretically observable order of preferences. But the way in which he then uses the theory is very similar to Walras, in that a few observations are used with formal reasoning to predict large societal structures. Microfoundations as a legacy of axiomatic idealism. Microfoundations could be thought of as a new type of idealism in economics, emerging out of conflict between Keynesian descriptivist attitudes to macroeconomics and neoclassical idealist methodologies. Here, the emphasis of macroeconomic theories is put on deducing macroeconomic behavior rather than analyzing the empirical examples of it, no matter how inadequate or unsuitable current mathematical aggregation techniques may be for this task. However, you can only be deductive if you have a well-functioning deductive methodology. Part of the reason maths, physics, and engineering work is the maturity of these deductive methodologies. Possibly agent-based modeling may develop into a more sound deductive methodology in economics, but the mathematically simple aggregation of neoclassical economics is simply inadequate. Neoclassical utopian idealism and hidden value judgments. The use of the idea of Pareto optimality in neoclassical economics is a moral claim, and a deeply conservative one at that. The idea that only changes which do not harm anyone's interests can be objectively shown to be increasing welfare reinforces existing inequalities and protects the status quo. Further, there are numerous implicit value judgments in neoclassical economics, even if they are not fully stated. For example, the choice not to account for non-monetized care work is an ideological and patriarchal claim, not an objective and scientific one. Further, idealism and abstraction, although distinct, can often have very similar effects. Both allow for a theory removed from the immediacy of everyday struggles, and to some extent allow a more positive picture of the economy to be described. Although neoclassical economic analysis does not per se theoretically depend on portraying a positive picture of economic growth, its political legitimacy does rest on its ability to create or claim to create policies which result in high growth and development. It is much more difficult to manufacture general political consent around ideas of indefinite growth than around Malthusian theory or even the creative destruction of Schumpeter. Thus, although there are glimpses of true human suffering in neoclassical economics, and a fundamental belief that wages should not rise beyond productivity, and there should be minimal welfare, essentially reducing people's rights to their usefulness to the wealthy classes, this is concealed within a narrative of inclusive market-driven growth. Conclusion. Both descriptivism and idealism are important in many ways in understanding real economies, predicting them and imagining better possibilities. However, neoclassical methodologies use only a narrow range of descriptive and idealistic methodologies, sometimes in inconsistent ways, and many of their claims that either idealism or descriptivism are more imitations at the aesthetics of other sciences than true imitations of the methodologies of other sciences.